Okay, so this is Seven Daughters and Seven Sons, Part 1, Chapter 4. Instead, I felt something cool and soft nuzzle my lap, and when I pulled my hands away from my eyes, I saw a baby camel, his nose searching the folds of my jibbeh for something to eat. When he found nothing, he turned his liquid eyes up to mine, and it seemed to me that he sighed. Ah, I actually smiled. Little one, I told him, you and I are in the same predicament. We're both hungry. But your mother wants to feed you as much as you want to eat. Why did you wander away from her? I stroked his rough, furry face. Were you longing for a bit of adventure? Let me tell you something, foolish little camel. Adventure in real life is nothing like adventure in the stories Scheherazade told. I stood up and untied the waist cord that held my jibbeh closed. The camel stood still and unresisting as I fastened it about his neck. With my sleeve, I wiped my cheeks and nose and trusted the blackness of the night to hide the redness of my eyes. I led the camel back to the Khan. He probably belonged to Gindar. Most of the animals on a caravan were supplied by the chief. I searched the groups gathered in the courtyard, hoping to recognize the form of Gindar or his vizier, Abu Sinan. I found them together, seated with 3 or 4 merchants in the remotest corner of the inner roofed court. Servants were clearing away an elaborate meal, such as might have graced my uncle's table. Kings of the desert, like Gindar, lived well. I approached the group slowly, still leading the little camel. I bowed. Pardon the interruption, Chief, I murmured, but I found this baby wandering alone outside the town, and I don't know to whom he belongs. Gindar glanced up at me from the plate before him, laden with sweetmeats. He's not ours. A man who tethers his animals improperly deserves to lose them, he said. But leave him here. Whoever owns him will come crying to me as soon as he notices the creature is missing. Of course, that was the case. Camels were expensive. The loss of one wouldn't be taken lightly. Gindar gestured to Abu Sinan, as if instructing him to show me where to tie the little camel. But then, suddenly, he changed his mind and leaped to his feet himself. Follow me, he said. Bring the baby. I walked behind him. We moved through the great room and out into the open court, where rows of stakes had been driven into the ground. Camels, donkeys, and a couple of horses were tethered to the stakes. Other camels stood about, one of their front legs hobbled so they couldn't move far. Gindar took the rope from my hand. As he did so, he leaned his face close to mine. Well, Nazir, you don't look very cheerful, he said. Jiha isn't such a pleasant employer, is he? No, I agreed. He is not. But it is lucky for the camel you ran outside the camp to weep for a little while. If you hadn't, he'd have been lost in the desert, a jackal or a vulture's dinner. I flushed with embarrassment. What kind of boy would Gindar imagine me to be, knowing now that I wept like a girl? Gindar guessed my thoughts. Don't blush, Nazir, he said quietly. It is no disgrace for a servant of Jiha's to weep. I've never known one who didn't. His words emboldened me. I can't stay with him. Even if I die in the desert, I can't stay with him. Oh, you'll stay with him, Gindar replied, his voice cool. You'll stay with him until we get to the coast. By then, The flab on your arms will have turned to muscle. The weight on your hips will have disappeared. Your skin will have turned brown in the sun, and your head will be full of wisdom. No one will get the best of you after you've crossed the desert in the company of Jihad. Don't forget that, Nazir. Then he walked away from me, leading the camel to one of the nearby stakes. The poor creature was bleating pitifully. So hungry was he now for his mother's milk. I hoped he wouldn't have to wait long until his owner came in search of him. I returned to Jiha and more curses. But this time I didn't cry. Words couldn't hurt me. They couldn't even insult my spirit if I didn't let them. And the next morning, when I woke up, I found a loaf of flatbread and some dates next to my bedroll. Who could have left it there? Not Jiha, for sure. But it could have been Abu Sinan, under Gindar's instructions, or Gindar himself, or one of my generous spirited fellow travelers. 2 hours past dawn, we moved out once again. We stayed close to the Euphrates River all day long, and a few hours after the setting of the sun, we came to the town of Al-Raqqa, where a good-sized stream joins the river. We could find no place in any of the khans, and had to camp in the open air just within the walls of the town. We were to do that more than once in the course of our journey. 3 more days of traveling brought us to Aleppo. Aleppo I knew. Everyone in Baghdad knew Aleppo. It was the commercial center of Syria, and the town to which my uncle planned soon to send his 7th son. Caravan routes passed through not only to Baghdad, but also to Persia and India in the east, Asia Minor and Europe in the west, Palestine and Egypt in the south. I trailed through the city's huge bazaar, listening as Jiha gossiped and bargained with shopkeepers. I kept both my ears wide open as he conducted wholesale business with traveling merchants right in the courtyards of khans and caravansaries, where the cloth, dried fruit, and licorice roots of Aleppo itself were traded for the wealth of the world. My chief was not a kind man, or a good man, or a man whom others liked very much, but he was a shrewd man. It seemed to me he came out ahead in every transaction. Perhaps he noticed how hard I listened. We stayed a week in Aleppo and then moved out toward Antioch. We camped one night on the way. After the caravan halted, I served his evening meal and then hurried away from him. I still had all the baggage to unpack. Jiha was so greedy, he didn't even allow me to unload the animals before I served his food. "Don't leave, boy," he called to me. "I want to speak to you." The camels and donkey had been walking in heat and dust, their backs laden with heavy packs for 12 hours, with only a brief respite at midday. They were more in need of their dinner than he was. "Rais," I protested, "Kafi is crying for something to eat." Kafi was the camel Jiha rode. "If I don't feed her soon, she'll get sick, perhaps even die." He understood that. Kafi was worth at least 15 dinars, and if anything happened to her on the journey, Gindar might hold Jiha responsible. "All right," he agreed grudgingly, "but come back as soon as you're done. Bring a bowl. You can have some soup." I couldn't believe he was actually going to give me something to eat. I took care of the animals as quickly as I could, picked up a bowl from the small supply of copper vessels he carried in one of his packs, and joined him at the campfire. "Sit down," he ordered. I held out the bowl. He stared at it as if he hadn't the remotest notion of the use to which such an object was put. Then he lifted the pot off the fire and poured just enough soup in my bowl to cover the design on the bottom, and not one drop more. I drank it quickly. I would have enjoyed it some more with some bread, but if Jiha knew I had a little food of my own, I was sure he'd never give me another morsel. "You made a mistake last week," he said. "I made a lot of mistakes last week," I replied. He actually smiled. I thought his cheeks might split from the effort. "I'm talking about the baby camel. He belonged to the son of Selim the One-Eared." "Oh? You should have come to me with the camel. I would have seen to it that you got the reward you deserved for returning it. Selim's rich as the Caliph. He didn't earn his money honestly, I can tell you that. He's cheated me more than once." "You would have seen to it that I got a reward?" I made no effort to keep the irony out of my voice. Let him beat me if he wanted. Since the few lashes I'd had felt from him always stopped short of doing any real damage, I wasn't going to let their possibility crush me. But Jihad didn't seem angry at me for speaking out. "Handing that camel over to Gindar did no one any good," he said in a reasonable tone. "Except Selim the One-Eared son, who shouldn't have to pay again for what's already his," I pointed out. "It would have been a lesson to him. The sooner he learns that carelessness is expensive, the better off he'll be. He knows nothing about business, and neither do you." He glanced at me fleetingly, out of the corner of his eye. "My father's a merchant," I protested, stung. "In a very small way," Jiha reminded me. "Else you wouldn't be traveling caravan as my servant." What he said was true. I looked up at him. "Teach me," I said. "Teach you so that you can leave me," he retorted sharply. I smiled a little. "I'm not much of a servant." "You're improving." He picked up his soup bowl and poured the liquid into his mouth. It was several seconds before he could speak again. "But I have no illusions. I know you'll leave me anyway when we get to Tyr, if you even last that long." I didn't deny it. "In Tyr, you'll find a better servant than I ever could be." I was actually consoling him. The fire danced before us, and I stared into it as I spoke. All around us the ground was sprinkled with other fires that matched the fires in the star-studded sky. The warm smell and soft murmuring voices of beasts flowed about us, and in the distance I could hear a single voice singing. For the first time in over a week, I'd had almost enough to eat. I felt warm, drowsy, comfortable. I felt as if Jiha were almost my friend. The evening must have been working on him in the same way. "There's more to you than meets the eye, Nazir," he said. It was the first time he'd spoken my name. I thought he'd forgotten it. "Obviously you're poor, or you wouldn't have consented to travel as my servant. On the other hand, you speak like an educated man. You can read, and, I dare say, write, and you had none of the skills a poor boy ought to possess. You couldn't saddle an animal. You couldn't fasten a pack. All you could manage those first couple of days was a little cooking. But you learned fast. Very fast." He uttered a sound that fell halfway between a cough and a laugh. "I know you watch me and listen to me. If you learn buying and selling as fast as you learned the knowledge of the trail, you'll drive the rest of us out of business in a month's time." I don't want to drive anyone out of business, I said. In all the great stretch of land, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, there must be enough goods for me to trade without taking food out of anyone else's mouth. You know nothing, boy, Jiha responded derisively. There are only so many people, and so many goods, and so much money. I leaned forward. I wanted to be sure he understood me. I had been thinking about the matter for a long time, for more than a year, ever since Hassan had visited our house before departing for Alexandria. It was then that the vague dreams with which I'd always filled my mind before I fell asleep began to take more definite forms. Fantasies turned into plans. There isn't a woman in Baghdad who doesn't have a bottle of rose water to use when she wants to make sure her body gives off a pleasant odor, I said. Jiha nodded. Of course. Rose water is a very good item. But don't think of rose water. Selim the One-Eared has cornered the market in Damascus. The pressers sell only to him. He told them he'd slit their throats if they sold to anyone else, and they believe him. You've never seen Selim the One-Eared. He's twice as tall as his son, and his son stretches higher than Gindar. However, Jiha added thoughtfully, sending his son to Damascus instead of going himself this time was a mistake. The son is stupid. Maybe rosewater isn't such a bad idea after all. If my son had lived, he'd have danced circles around the son of Selim the One-Eared. Oh, be quiet and listen to me, I cried impatiently. You haven't given me a chance to make my point. Then it struck me that I was speaking to my employer, my violent-tempered employer, as if I were his equal. Pardon my words, O Rais, I added hastily. My great joy at my chief's benevolence in deigning to carry on a conversation with me has perhaps overcome my manners. But Jiha merely grunted. I took his as a signal to continue. The rose water is only an example. Once upon a time, there was no such thing as rose water. And then, somewhere, someone got the idea of capturing the scent of roses, so that women as well as flowers could give off sweet odors. From the day God created the world until that moment, women had lived perfectly well without rose water. But if you told them that now, they wouldn't believe you. Rose water has become a necessity. The poorest woman buys at least a small vial of it to use on her wedding day. Rich women bathe in it. Jiha nodded slowly. What you say is true, boy. Somewhere in there, back at the beginning, fortunes were made. But I still don't understand what good that'll do you. I'm talking about another rose water, I said. Don't you see? There has to be something else, some other item just lying around waiting to be seized upon by a clever merchant who, by presenting it properly, will convince everyone that it is a necessity. That merchant will be me. I don't think there are any flowers left, Jiha responded gloomily. They've all been made into perfumes already. Oh, no, I cried, forgetting again to whom I was speaking. You're still missing the point. I don't want to sell something like rose water. I want to find something new, something that goes into an empty space. But what could that be? Jiha asked. There are no empty spaces. Everything human beings need or want already exists. Do you really believe, I asked him quietly, that nothing new waits for us? Do you really believe that? Jiha stared at me, his eyes wide with wonder. It was probably the first time since he'd grown up that his grease-encrusted brain had been penetrated by an idea that was something more than a repetition of a notion he'd thought about 500 times before. His eyes didn't hold mine for more than a second or two. Jiha wasn't comfortable with direct glances. He turned his gaze to the fire and stared into it without speaking. I didn't say anything either. I had to give him time to digest a new idea. But digest it he would, for his mind, if not original, was exceedingly shrewd. When he spoke again, it was with brisk matter-of-factness. "Well, lad," he said, "when you come upon such an item, I hope you'll allow me to back you. You'll need capital. I can supply it, and we can share in the profits. That'll be a good laugh on Selim the One-Eared." I wasn't surprised to hear him say that. True, I was only his servant, but if Jiha had sensed he could make money off a thief or an assassin, he wouldn't have hesitated to enter into an arrangement with him. But, like the thief or assassin, I'd be on my guard. I was sure he'd cheated Selim the One-Eared as often as Selim the One-Eared had cheated him. I'd find a way to ensure that he wouldn't cheat me. However, all I said out loud was, "Thank you, my chief. After we reach the coast, I'll remember this conversation." "And I'll remember it too," said Jiha. We spoke together many evenings after that. During the day, I was only his servant, and he screamed at me and cursed me with every other breath. But I followed him faithfully as he went about his business, and in the dark, especially while we were traveling, we forgot all that, and we became not exactly equals, not exactly friends, but something like that. Teacher and pupil, perhaps. He told me the best spot in a bazaar to locate a stall. He told me how to lay out goods so that they showed to advantage. He told me where and when to shop to acquire what I needed at the cheapest prices. He explained to me in detail the elaborate ritual of bargaining, which I knew in part from the buyer's end. It was a game I'd always enjoyed, though I'd rarely been allowed to play, since my mother enjoyed it too and did most of the shopping for our family. The merchant's side wasn't hard, not really. It just required a certain amount of willpower. The merchant knew what an item had cost him. He had to figure not only the cash he'd expended to obtain it, but also the expense he'd been put to get and then to sell it. To that, he added a reasonable margin of profit. That was the lowest price at which he dared to sell the item. He had that figure in his head, and he knew he couldn't go below it. It was better for him not to sell the thing, to keep it until another day, than to sell it below that previously determined figure. Usually. There were exceptions, which Jiha taught me all about them as well. If you had overbought on vests and the winter was nearly over, it was better to sell them cheap than to go through the bother and expense of storing them over the summer. The loss would be less than the cost of holding on to them. Sensing when the moment had come at which to let go, that, Jiha said, was an art and an instinct. No one could teach it to you. But, he added dryly, I don't doubt you possess it. As my father didn't, which was one reason he'd never earned more than a bare living. My father didn't have the courage trading required either. You see, Jiha explained, sometimes you have to take a risk. It's your instinct that tells you when to do that too. Take those vests I was talking about. At a bazaar, In a little village late in the summer, you come across an old woman with 100 of them to sell. She's been making them for years. She's selling them very cheap. Should you buy them? If we have a cold winter, you'll make a good profit. If the winter's mild, you're stuck with them. You weigh all the factors. The last 3 winters have been mild. We seem about due for a cold one. On the other hand, the fortune teller with whom you chatted in the souk said we are in a cycle of 7 warm winters to be followed by 7 cold ones. But then again, how much does the fortune teller really know? Is he truly a competent fortune teller, or just a charlatan? These are the things you have to consider, all very quickly, before deciding whether or not to take the risk. But sometimes you do. Sometimes you must. You'll never make a decent living unless you're willing, sometimes, to take a risk. As my father wasn't. As he thought he couldn't afford to be. As he should have been, for truly, he didn't have much to lose. And then I realized that at last my father had taken a risk. He'd taken a risk on me. Jiha was still talking. That's why I'm willing to back you when you decide what it is you want to buy and then sell to fill up the empty space, he said. That and my desire to beat out old Selim. Backing you will be a risk, but I've always known when to take a risk and when not to. Oh, naturally, I've made a few mistakes, but not many. I wouldn't be where I am today if I had. I learned a great deal from Jiha. I learned so much that it was worth every crossword, every curse to have served him on those journeyings across the desert and during all those weeks in the bazaars and souks of Aleppo, Antioch, Latakia, Beirut, and Damascus. I became convinced that the product I would sell was growing quiet and unnoticed somewhere in a wilderness or oasis, or along the banks of a tiny stream. It was the sweet attar of a hidden flower, or the soothing drug or unguent from a secret plant. Meanwhile, I learned what I could about the business of buying and selling perfumes and medicinal herbs, asking, listening, watching everywhere we went. The caravan broke up in Damascus. A few of us, including Jiha and myself, accompanied Gindar and Abu Sinan west to the coastal city of Tira. Summer was nearly gone by the time we got there. As Gindar had predicted the night I'd returned the baby camel, the flab on my arms had turned to muscle. The weight on my hips had disappeared. My skin was dark, and my head was full of all that I'd learned on the way. Before the remnants of the caravan dispersed, I sought out Gindar. I knew he wouldn't remain long in Tira. In a week's time or less, he'd be traveling across the desert again, if not back to Baghdad, then south through the Arabian Peninsula to some distant city unreachable from the coast by any means except the back of a camel. I found him in his room in the caravanserai with Abu Sinan, collecting the money still owed him by the last of the travelers, who'd paid him half prior to departing, and now owed him the other half upon their safe arrival. I waited until his business with the others was done, and then I stepped forward. "Why are you here, Nazir?" he asked when he saw me. "You don't owe me anything. Between the return of the baby camel and the way you kept Jiha too occupied to make trouble for anyone else, I should pay you for having traveled with us." "Surely," I replied, "I owe you my thanks. Everything you said would happen has happened. I'm strong. I'm wiry. I don't know if I'm wise, but Jiha and my own eyes have certainly taught me things I'd never before even guessed at." Gindar nodded. "You're a man now, my friend. He smiled a little and added very softly, insofar as that's possible. My hand went to my breast and pulled the two edges of my jubba tightly together. I didn't know what to say. To tell the truth, after 12 weeks among men only, after 12 weeks without ever looking at my own self, I'd almost forgotten I was a woman. That doesn't mean I thought of myself as a man. I was only me, Nazir, servant and student of the merchant Jiha. I glanced at Abu Sinan. Had he heard what Gindar had said? Apparently, for he nodded slightly. What Gindar knew, Abu Sinan knew. Your secret's safe, my friend, Gindar said. No one would guess now. A season's travel has taken care of that. But if you knew, I whispered, why did you let me come? Gindar shrugged. My mother is a black woman, he said. She was a slave stolen from a tribe that lived south of the Sahara. My father was an Arab trader whose name she's forgotten and I never knew. I've made my way in the world by my wits and my strength and my skills. I know the desert like the palm of my hand, and men such as my father must pay me very well for the benefit of that knowledge. Very well. Yes, I agreed. Very well indeed. 5 dinars supports my father's entire house for weeks. I am rich, he said. I bought my mother out of slavery long ago. I could buy 1,000 others like her, but I don't. I don't spend all my substance freeing her people. The cheerfulness that usually graced his face was gone. He looked so stricken as he said those words that my heart went out to him. Surely God requires no such sacrifice from you, I tried to comfort him. It's not a matter of what God requires of me, he said. It is a matter of what I require of myself. His smile was grim. You're running away from some kind of slavery, aren't you? I opened my mouth to explain, but he held up his hand. I don't need to know what it is. A cruel father, a distasteful marriage, an importunate master. I don't want to know. On my caravan, I don't ask questions. I told you that once before. It is enough for me to realize I didn't send you back to a slave's existence. I have more to thank you for than I dreamed. There was nothing else I could say. He rose and held out his hand. I took it, grasping it firmly in mind. Your hand is small, friend Nazir, he said, but it's hard and strong. No one will know until you choose to let them know. He shook mine, hard. And that's the thing you'll do when you yourself are satisfied with who you are or have become. You know you can trust me. I never doubted it, I replied quietly. Today I have less reason to doubt it than ever. He nodded. If at any time you need a message or goods or money sent to Baghdad, I'll do it. I'm usually in Tira a couple of times a year. Whatever you give me will be delivered just as you handed it to me. Whatever secret you entrust me won't go a jot beyond my ears. Thank you, Gindar. I'll remember that. There is nothing to add then, he said, smiling, except good luck. Peace be with you, Nazir, my friend. And with you. Peace, Rais Gindar, I returned. Then I picked up my bundle, straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and marched out of the caravanserai like a soldier. Jiha had gone to the bathhouse to wash the dust of the long journey from his flesh. He had a lot of flesh to wash. It would take him a long time. He'd suggested that I accompany him, but I had told him I couldn't let Gindar depart without making a proper farewell. I'd told Jiha I'd wait for him in the khan, but I didn't. I had questioned him closely about the town and its surroundings. When I left the caravanserai, I made my way through city streets to the widest gate in the city wall. I walked swiftly across a flat plain and then turned and headed toward the sea. There, on a deserted strip of beach, I took off all my clothes and bathed myself. I had never before washed myself anywhere but in the large wooden tub my mother placed in our courtyard or our room. I had certainly never bathed in the sea. I'd never even seen the sea. But as soon as I laid eyes upon it, I couldn't wait until I was in it. The sight, the sound, the smell of it were like the sight and sound and smell of home. It seemed to me that I belonged in it. And when the bitter taste of salt filled my mouth, when its sharpness stung my eyes, when clear blue-greenness lapped over my head, I knew that the sea felt like home, too. Every one of my senses was filled with delight at the very same moment. Truly, if nothing more happened to me on my journey than this experience of wave and whitecap, I would be satisfied. At least, that's how I felt at the moment. I came out of the water and stood dripping on the empty beach, warm sand between my toes, warm sun beating on my back, my body tingling clean. Hastily, I dried myself. I threw on my clothes and hurried back toward the town. Now, I was ready. I was ready for whatever fate awaited me behind the high, white walls of Tira. End of part 1.